Hello and welcome, dear friends and friends of gartenschlau.com. Today we're talking about the topic of vegetative propagation of figs. So about cuttings / slips. And I'll explain that to you in this video. When is the best time of year to cut slips from the figs and then prepare them accordingly so that by spring they have developed accordingly and can then continue to grow as new plants. This period is roughly between December and the end of February, and that is also the time where the figs, let's say, are in their dormant phase and where the worst frosts might have already passed. What do I cut from the fig for the slip? Here we see I have two fig trees. First, this is the fig Madeleine de saison. So that means a fig variety that bears fruit twice a year. And then I have the Charnot here. With figs, it's always a bit tricky. There are always fanciful names. Sure, there are also registered fig varieties. If you're buying this mass-produced stuff somewhere at the hardware store, gartner.de or wherever, which is explicitly sold there, simply because the price range is different, then there are often all sorts of fanciful names on them. And that can definitely be a different variety. But that's a different topic. We'll get to that at some point. To talk about in another post, what do I cut as a slip from my fig tree now? We see here at the tips of the shoots, is the shoot still green? That's too green. It usually won't be very successful in developing into a slip. But we take a completed shoot that has already finished growing. So anywhere, the shoot is brown, it's just right for that to be able to form a cutting, let's say. It's also important that the length of the cutting is right. So the nodes and internodes are present accordingly. Now I'm looking at the plant. There's still a lot of green here. The Madame is still out and about here. It's not being hidden. Left. What am I hiding here? Left. I'm just taking a look at it. In autumn, it is of course a good idea to trim the fig back a bit. You have to be careful though. You never know how cold it will get. If it gets too cold, then it can certainly be that the pruning that has been done now leads to that practically what would have frozen up here is then down here. And then there's not much left of the fig. That's why it's a good idea. With such small figs, normally I wouldn't necessarily cut a cutting from them, but I would let them grow until it is appropriately large. But to show that, I want to do it so. With small figs, it's a good idea to winter them when you have pruned them back. Now I'm checking that the cutting is ultimately, it's long enough. What's important is that we need 3 nodes and 2 internodes. So a cutting that is 2 internodes long. If you cut a lot of cuttings now, you cut off the top here and the bottom here. Then in the end, you don't necessarily know which way does this cutting go. There are 2 tricks to recognize which way the cutting goes. On one hand, the dormant bud that will sprout is usually always located above the node. So you should never say one, or you should never say that. In horticulture, there's always something else, but the bud should always be above the node. That also ensures that the cutting has been planted correctly. There's another trick, and it concerns the scissors you use. That means when you cut this shoot now, I'm just going to do it here. It's important to have clean, disinfected, sharp scissors. Then the cut that at the bottom end has been made diagonally, and the cut that is made at the top straight. Because if there are no leaves left on the cutting now, I'm just going to cut them off. Then you would have the orientation the top is cut straight. The bottom is cut at an angle. So the bottom is where it's angled, and that's how you can remember it. Then you can also lay down a lot of cuttings. And here you can also see the bud is positioned above the node, meaning if you don't know which direction to look, where the bud is, it can sprout, and that has to be above the node. For those who don't know what a node and an internode are, a node is always there. Where there's a leaf bud, that's a node, and between two nodes is the internode. So between nodes, so it's really easy to remember. If we have this cutting here, there are several ways to get this to root. I just want to say a little something about the head cutting. Generally, you take a normal wood cutting, a cutting wood where there is no shoot tip at the top that has it too. Also, just to add the reason, when you see that these buds here are sprouting, because the cutting first sprouts the shoot and then the roots. That means when you see it sprouting, that's still not a sign that there are roots at the bottom, but it's a sign that this cutting is still vital. Of course, you can also take a head cutting. You see this part is green, and you shouldn't take that as a cutting. If you absolutely have to. If you're taking a head cutting, then you first cut away the dormant buds here. It is also recommended to cut off the largest amount of leaves, just to keep evaporation as low as possible. You can also halve the leaves. That used to be a very common method. It also has the advantage if you don't have a greenhouse, where you can raise the humidity, then it helps you overall. My recommendation is, if you have something like this here, you have a cutting, that's something you should stick in the pot. If you have a head cutting now, it's of course a good idea to put this in a glass of water to root it. And then there's one more point. I just need to take a quick look if I have it here. Yes, I have it here. Now I need to drain the cutting here. Let the cutting drain briefly. If you want to disinfect the cut surface, you can do so with tree wax. Or you can just use charcoal powder. Charcoal powder disinfects just as well. You can grind charcoal or you can buy it in the store. This is just regular charcoal powder. Dip the cutting and then it's basically disinfected and the spot is practically sealed off as well. The next thing is, if you have such a cutting, you can of course dip it in a rooting hormone. It comes in gel form and in powder form. Which form you choose depends on what you can best get. However, you don't necessarily need it because the rooting itself is quite reliable. So this story here is now basically at the point where you can disinfect it and put it in water. If that's the case, you can also get AB, dab it and put it directly in water. It doesn't matter now. Here it's washing off the charcoal powder. Let's talk about cuttings. The cutting variant is actually a relatively simple thing. Ideally, as I mentioned, you cut the cuttings from December to the end of February. However, you should also keep an eye on the weather. If late frosts really come, you have to bring the plant inside. If it's a young one, even if it's an older one, the shorter the plant is, the more it can freeze. In the end, it can freeze. And then the plant is, ideally, or in the worst case, damaged. Freezing. And then the plant is, ideally, or in the worst case, damaged. Yes, you should plant the cutting as deep as possible in the soil. So I would say the upper node should just be sticking out. The lower node, those are the points where roots particularly like to sprout, because there is a calm in the bud and there's really a lot of plant hormone in this node. And depending on how the plant decides now what's supposed to happen, whether it's a shoot or a root, that's obviously beneficial. If you have a node right at the bottom, if you were to cut it at the internode now, the likelihood is very high that the roots are sprouting here while not much is happening here. You could influence it with a rooting hormone, but this way is better. When you plant the cutting, as I said, relatively deep, just below the top bud, it also has the advantage that evaporation is restricted again. In other words, the cutting stays much longer, vital, without drying out quickly. In other words, you can just stick it in a pot like this. Whether it's blumener.de or kokoser.de or gartner.de, it really doesn't matter at all. That works so far. This is what it looks like. You then place them, for example, in the hallway or a garage where light no frost, where it doesn't get too hot. There it can stand. You can also plant them in the garden in a relatively mild sheltered corner where it can then root That can take quite a few weeks, months, until everything has developed properly and the plant can then be further cultivated. Additionally, it makes sense to add when you put 2 to 3 cuttings into such a pot, then the probability is of course big that at least 1, if not even 2 or 3 survive. And then the plant is practically ready because it develops here in this pot. There's another option. I didn't want to show you that directly on the plant, but just explain that's the rooting. That basically means, well, this is purely hypothetical. You take a flower pot and wedge it in here, and then it develops on the plant. Roots are developing. Using a flower pot isn't actually such a bad idea. That means I first need a flower pot. So I'm just going to take a completely ordinary, commercially available flower pot. I think this rooting method isn't that common yet. Then you cut here at this point a hole. Ideally, you do it in a way that the flower pot stands out and is collapsible again. Then you can go ahead, place the flower pot here, secure it with tape or a rubber band so that it stays in place, and then fill this pot with soil. And the likelihood that the plant, which is now sitting in this pot, can root properly is very, very high, and then you cut the plant off at the bottom and that topic is done. And the advantage is the plant would then even be potted. That would be one method. You can use another method. You make a bag loop or something like that, tie it around here, put a rubber band at the bottom. The bag is open, fill it with moss or substrate and close the bag at the top. And then it will also be covered with moss accordingly. The advantage of this is that the cutting is still attached to the plant, still gets energy through the plant, and you can be relatively relaxed so that the root growth can really take its time. With our cutting that is here in the water, if you ask yourself the question, I'm just going to pour out a little bit of water. Because there's a bottle here too much, there should be at most these 2 notes in the water. The water is now black because the charcoal powder is in it. Here, the rooting usually takes about 1 to 1.5 to 2 months. And then the cutting is rooted here. You know this from the other videos where I've also shown cuttings. As soon as the roots are nice and long, about 4 to 6 centimeters, then you can repot the cutting. As long as there are still small white little dots, or however you want to call them at first glance, those are still not finished roots. That's still callus tissue, so closure tissue, where something can form, but doesn't have to. As soon as it shows that there are really roots, you take a pot. You always take a pot for a plant, or you could theoretically just plant it directly in the garden. With the cuttings, that works too. You can theoretically plant them directly in the garden and let them develop there. Then you place the plant inside. The recommendation is not to fill it up with substrate first and then shove it in, but because the roots are very sensitive, put a little bit of soil in the bottom, about 1 to 2 centimeters. Place the cutting on the soil, hold it carefully, and gently fill it up with soil. Tap it a little so that everything spreads out between the roots, and then the plant can continue to develop accordingly. As I said, first the shoot develops, then the roots. So don't let yourself be confused and then think, oh, it's already growing, let's see if we can pull something out. You'll probably be able to pull the plant out. Yes, I hope I have helped you a little. Be able to show something. On the topic of cutting formation in figs, the topic will be expanded a bit more next year. That was more or less an introduction. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments. Otherwise, thumbs up, subscribe to the channel. See you next time, and bye.